please welcome Dr. Alex Garza.
Good afternoon, everybody. How about a round of applause for all our award recipients again? I mean, it's phenomenal to be sharing a stage with Bob. You know, people say the reason why you change such heights is because you're standing on the shoulder of giants. And Bob and Brian and everybody that was awarded today is certainly a giant. So the talk today is going to be the role of EMS in healthcare. Now, if you would have told me when I was a 19-year-old, what behind the ears, EMT, taking patients from a nursing home back to the hospital and back and forth, that someday I'd be standing in front of hundreds of EMS providers as a keynote speaker, well, you probably would have been that patient who I was taking from the nursing home back to the hospital, because I wouldn't have believed you. And I've been very blessed in my career, been very fortunate to have done the things that I've done. So in thinking about this talk, you know, I was talking with AJ, what should we talk about at this keynote? And he said, well, you know, it's going to be in DC, the Affordable Care Act, all of this stuff. And I said, yeah, you know, that's kind of a wonky title, though. Everybody knows what a wonk is, right? I'm not using some weird term here. Well, we do a lot of wonky stuff in DC. And so I thought about it, and I was like, yeah, you know, wonky stuff is just not that entertaining. It's just not. Believe me, it's not. So I thought, you know, this sounds like a title that should really be on something like, I don't know, something like C-SPAN, right? But I don't think, you know, that most people really like C-SPAN all that much. I personally have watched a lot of C-SPAN. And the reason for that is because I usually had to have white noise on in the background as I was sleeping during the day when I worked the night shift as a medic. And I think some of it filtered through during my REM sleep. But anyway, you know, people say, well, you know, sometimes they mess up my name. And I say, you can call me whatever you want because I've been chewed out by some of the best in the country in front of TV. And so it doesn't bother me all that much. But anyway, talking about wonky stuff is just not that fun. So I thought we could talk about something a little bit interesting, a little bit more fun. And what could be more fun than healthcare.gov, right? So you don't need me to beat them up. They're beating themselves up. You know, some of it's deserved, some of it not. I can tell you from working in the federal bureaucracy that sometimes getting these things up and off the ground is really hard. Just the Byzantine system you got to work through to get big projects like this up and off the board. It's tough. It really is. But, you know, you don't need me to make fun of them. So, but the issue was that it didn't really have to be that way. And I think one of the principal things we learned from this is that, you know, be who you are. So HHS is inherently not an IT company, right? But they were asked to put together this very difficult project. The frustrating thing is that there are people within the federal government who are really good at this stuff. They can build IT systems that work pretty flawlessly. And really, all they had to do was pick up the phone and call the NSA. These guys are really, really good at IT. Let me tell you. And they're even located pretty close to each other. The Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services in Baltimore. NSA is in Fort Meade, which is about halfway between. You could have just walked, you know, drove down the road and gotten all this accomplished. So, but anyway, just imagine what it would have been like if NSA had created healthcare.gov. I mean, all you would really have to do is navigate over to the web page, right? And then you let the magic begin. You don't even have to type anything. They already know who you are, right? They know what your address is, your zip code. They know what medications you're taking. They know what your medical problems are. And because you posted on Facebook last week about that weird rash you got, they know that too, all right? They probably know diseases that you don't even know you have. So this is how it would work. They would enter in all the information for you. You just cycle through to the last page, and this is what happens. They say, based on your medical profile, you really need this plan. You need the gold plan. But since they got access to your financial records, look, we know how much money you make, including all that illegal stuff you did, filming the Super Bowl. You can really afford this plan. You wouldn't even have to set up the payment. They're just going to take it, right? But, I mean, they are humans as well, so they're going to try and give you a little bit of control over your life. So we'll let you log out if it makes you feel better. And since they're listening to your cell phone calls anyway, they're going to remind you to call your mom. This is how it would work. Leave it to the professionals, all right? That's the point here. Anyway, this is to show you that I'm still trying to detoxify from being a Fed. That's what this slide is. I'm trying my best because you notice I didn't wear a tie, and I'm wearing a shirt that is in the primary color scheme, all right? You can tell who the Feds are downstairs, can't you? All right. So, in doing some research for this talk, I came across this newspaper article. This was an EMT who said this in 1991. If more doctors saw what we see every day, medicine would be practiced differently. Pretty bold statement for an EMT, right? But I bet a lot of you guys agree with that, right? So think about that as we walk through this talk. So I want to talk to you today about three things. U.S. healthcare and the economy, how EMS has to change to be relevant in the face of that economy, and then some personal lessons that I've learned from sitting in that ambulance as an EMT to sitting in the situation room next to the president. And my goals are, if you've learned something new that you didn't know before, if you think of something in a different light, or even if you just laugh at some of the stupid stuff that I've done throughout my life, we'll call it a success. But I want to tie it all together with this theory of evolution, and it's going to make sense here in just a minute. You're probably thinking Garza's gone off the deep end. And I have gone off the deep end, but it has nothing to do with this lecture. So we're going to talk about it in terms of evolution. Now, evolution is a funny word, right? Now, most people would understand these definitions. So it comes from the Latin. It means to unroll or take its true form. Modern day definition is the gradual development of something, especially something simple to more complex. So you think healthcare is getting more complex? Yeah. You think EMS is getting more complex? Yeah. Your life gets more complex as it goes on, right? Until you retire, right, Bob? Then it becomes more simple, right? Evolution. So most people would understand that evolution comes from Charles Darwin, right? Everybody understands. He wrote this, his signature paper on the origin of species. But the truth be known, Charles Darwin only used the word evolution once in this entire book. And it was on the last page of the last sentence. And I'm going to show it to you right here. Because I think it's just a phenomenal piece of writing. People don't write like this anymore. There's grandeur in this way of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone circling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I found this statement shocking because there's always this pitched battle between evolution and creationism, and if you read Charles Darwin's writing, he really blends both of them, and he does it beautifully. But we're not going to talk about Charles Darwin. We're going to talk about a different biologist, this gentleman. His name is Van Valen, and he's an evolutionary biologist. He passed away a couple of years ago. Now, you have to wear a beard if you're a biologist, apparently. But he wrote this theory back in 1973, and it's called the Red Queen's hypothesis. And it's a fascinating hypothesis. So in it, he's trying to explain. So he uses Alice in Wonderland, so reach back to your high school literature to think about Alice in Wonderland. And through the looking glass, Alice is running, and she's running really fast with the Red Queen. They stop, and Alice notices she hasn't gone anywhere. And she's out of breath. And she turns to the Red Queen and she says, in my world, when we run really fast, we actually get somewhere. And the Red Queen turns to her and says, now look, down here you have to run really fast just to stay in the same place. Who feels like they run really fast just to stay in the same place? I know I did as a Fed. Well, what he was trying to get across is that there's a couple of things that really influence evolution. One is the environment, and one is competition amongst species. And we're going to talk about these here in a second. So let's talk about the evolution of healthcare economics under these terms. So a lot of times, healthcare economics get really boiled down to talking points that politicians throw back and forth at each other, and it doesn't do anybody any good. We have to have a serious discussion about this, not PR. So let me share with you, this is going to be the wonky part of the talk, all right? I'm going to throw some numbers at you. Don't be afraid. It'll all make sense. I'm going to use an example of rental housing. So some of you may own some rental units. So let's say you own some rental housing. You get rent in, and you pay for fixing the house. You know, you can repair some windows and replace carpet and stuff like that. And things are going great. You're making some money, you have enough money that you put it into a trust account, everything's going swell. Sooner or later, though, these houses start to break down. And they all seem to be breaking down. And you're repairing windows, and you're replacing carpet, and you're fixing plumbing, but you're not so good at, keeping track of where all the money goes or what you've replaced. And so you end up replacing the same window twice in a year. Your contractors don't talk to each other, so they're, doing all this crazy stuff inside. After a while, you're spending a lot of money trying to keep these rental houses up to date. So much money that you're starting to cut back now on all the other things that you do. So you're not going on a vacation. You're not buying your kids new tennis shoes. You're not buying a new car. And pretty soon it comes to the point where you don't have any of your trust fund left over because you're spending it all on keeping these houses up. That's healthcare economics right now. So I could end the lecture right now, and you would know more about healthcare economics than 90% of this city. The U.S. budget in 2012, here comes the numbers, $3.5 trillion. What is the biggest slice of the pie? The biggest slice of the pie of the federal budget is healthcare, 22%. The biggest three slices, healthcare, Social Security, and defense, over 60% of the budget. If you spent no money on anything, 60% goes to those three programs. 23% of the gross domestic product. Our gross domestic product is around $16 trillion a year. The biggest GDP in the world. So that's not even half of the problem. So we spend that big chunk in the federal budget on health care. It's Medicare and Medicaid. That's all it is. But if you include all of the other costs from private insurers, from VA, from Indian Health Services, from all those other programs, it's around $2.8 trillion. So getting close to what we spend on the entire federal budget. 17% of gross domestic product. $8,915. That's how much the United States spends on every man, woman, and child on health care in this country. $8,915. So you would think, hey, that's a lot of money. I bet we have the best health care in the world. We spend so much money on it, right? And you go out and spend that kind of money on a car or whatnot, you expect to get a really nice car. Well, let's talk about how we got here first. In 1970, the percentage of money from the gross domestic product that went to health care was 7%. 7. It's now at 17. This is a chart of all the other economically developed countries in the world. Their growth has maintained their growth of GDP. You see ours has skyrocketed. On average, we spend about 2% to 2.5% more than the economy is growing. That's why you see such a divergence between what other countries do and what the United States does. So again, you're thinking, what is this by? The United States right now ranks around 37th in the world in health measures, all told. 37th. I thought this slide was appropriately telling. So this is mortality versus the amount of money. So remember I told you around $9,000 a person? So what does that get you? It gets you around 75 years of age, 77. Look at Japan. They spend around $2,500 per person per year. They live up into their mid-80s. So we can't really say what we're spending money on is really providing benefit to us in the population. So how about EMS? How much does EMS take up part of this pie? It's relatively small. There's an interesting paper that came out last fall. This is the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General report. And if you can read down there on the bottom, it's a memorandum report, overview of the changes in the utilization of Medicare Part B ambulance reports from 2002 to 2011. And in this, they document the enormous rise of the cost that EMS has for the system. So here's a tip. Never be on an Office of Inspector General report. That is one of your goals when you're in the federal service. So the EMS costs in healthcare have gone from $600 million to $2.1 billion in a decade to $4.5 billion in another decade. The rate of growth has been, it tripled in one decade, and then it grew by 130% in another decade. The rate of growth for Medicare has been 74% for all comers. So people start to take notice of stuff like that when it's growing at that rate. And they use words like waste, fraud, and abuse. And people are starting to notice. How many people read this article in the New York Times? Front page, New York Times. So the New York Times has been running a series of articles about healthcare. Don't feel bad, they beat up us ER doctors the day before. But then they got down to EMS and how much EMS costs for the system and for the individual. Now, you know, they're reporters, so they're going to report what they want to report. Some of it was, you know, it was factual, but there's always a slant to it, and they're reporters. But the point is that people are starting to notice this stuff now. So, again, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more now about this catastrophe that we're facing in healthcare. And we'll run through this real quick. There's this thing called discretionary and non-discretionary spending. Discretionary spending means you can pick and choose what you want to fund. That was what my office was under. Non-discretionary means you got no say in it. Under public law, you fund it. You have to fund healthcare and Social Security. No questions asked. Those are called entitlements for a reason. So 40% of your budget you cannot touch. You cannot realize savings from that 40%. It all has to come out of the 60%. That takes away money for teachers, takes away bridge repair, takes away all that other stuff. Okay? Remember I talked about the rate of growth for healthcare? This is what's going to happen. It was in the CBO report. If you guys saw the headlines the other day about the CBO report, about people shifting out of jobs and healthcare and stuff like that, this is really the takeaway point of that report. Unless we do something to correct this problem, you'll be funding two things in the future: Social Security and healthcare, and the national, well, three things, and the national debt, and that's it. We won't have any more money. The other bad part, Medicare is running on empty. I mean, we talk a lot about the baby boom generation. They're starting to put that big strain on Medicare right now, and you get hit with a double whammy. People are starting to retire. Thanks, Bob. Causing a problem here. And the healthcare costs are going up. Now you're running out of money in your trust fund. We used to have a surplus in Medicare. We could pay the bills. No big deal. Now we're running out of money. There's not enough people in the workforce to take care of those retired folks that are on Medicare. So we got to do something, right? You got to do something. So how do you fix the problem? How do you fix it so that you can repair all those houses, still maintain your budget, everybody's happy? So you could raise revenue, right? Not really. I mean, nobody likes new taxes, right? And these people vote. You could curb entitlements. Not really. Because now you piss off. And then don't forget, they're the largest voting bloc out there, all right? Don't piss off grandma. And then you got people who don't really know that government really is Medicare, you damn socialist. And the problem here is if you don't fund things like education, then you don't fund people learning how to spell correctly so that they can protest appropriately. I'll let you look for the word that's misspelled. It's hard to take somebody seriously when they got a sign like that, right? But me being a fan of The Simpsons, I thought Grandpa Simpson said it best when he said, Medicare has extended this man's life so he will have more years to protest against government health care. There you go. But seriously, how do we fix this problem? Well, you got to do things like make the process more efficient. You got to show value. You need metrics. You need measures. You got to do more for less, right? Or you got to do the appropriate things. Not even more for less, but the appropriate things. We can't be paying to replace 3 windows in a year. So how are we doing that? So let's talk about the Red Queen's hypothesis. I'm going to shift a little bit now. Remember, environment, competition of species. So Van Valen said there's this evolutionary game. People live in this adaptive zone, and they compete for resources. Okay? Let's talk a little bit now about the evolution of EMS. So that's the evolution of the economy. So you guys all understand there is no way that we cannot keep going. We can't keep going forward the way that we are right now. Something has to give, or we're going to go bankrupt. So let's talk about the evolution of the practice of EMS now. So some of the things that I learned when I was in paramedic school, the ABCs of cardiac arrest. How many people were trained in the ABCs? How many people fought over the intubation tube with your other medics? Like it was some badge of courage, right? We had to get the tube. There's always airway breathing, and you know, as a physician, you'd walk into the room and you'd be like, how come nobody's doing CPR? You know? How many people were trained for hemorrhage control like this? You would have gotten your butt kicked if you would have come into the trauma bay with a tourniquet on. I guarantee it. So I found this on the internet, and I thought it was very appropriate to show how far we've come in EMS. If bleeding is not stopped after 15 minutes of direct pressure, apply strong pressure at one of these points between the wound and the heart. 15 minutes of bleeding? Are you kidding me? As a last resort, you can use the tourniquet. If bleeding cannot be stopped and the situation is life-threatening, so you need to make those two connections first. It has to be life-threatening. Can't use that tourniquet. Not life-threatening? No. Okay, now they've bled for 15 minutes. Now it's life-threatening. All right, put it on. Quick. How many people use mass trousers? We carried them on there. I never drug those things out once. I mean, seriously. Come on. Who's going to sit there and pump this little thing up on the scene? How many people use an EOA? Can you imagine having that jammed down your throat? I mean, that's crazy. The point is that medicine had to evolve and EMS had to evolve along with it, right? And so we learned things, but we learned it through science. And I'm so glad that we put an emphasis now on the people that do all of the science to make EMS better, to evolve EMS, to make it a dedicated medical professional. So now we learn, hey, maybe that circulation part's really kind of important, not so much that airway part. And unfortunately, we had to learn through multiple wars that tourniquets really do save lives, and you don't wait the 15 minutes and for it to become life-threatening in order to put a tourniquet on. So what does this mean? This is the adaptive zone. Science evolved and it started trumping dogma. All this other stuff was based off of dogma or really flimsy science, right? All this stuff eventually became extinct because science had much better resources to compete in this adaptive zone. And the resource that we competed for, that you people compete for every day, is patient lives. And this resource is very precious. And it's limited. And it deserves our attention. Healthcare delivery. There's been a lot of talk at this conference about healthcare delivery systems. A lot of talk about the Affordable Care Act. It was signed 4 years ago. We're finally getting to a discussion about it. The resource you compete for is money, right? Been a lot of talk about money. What does that mean? Let's talk about a couple of things. Has the environment changed in healthcare? Yes, it has. What was the primary driver of that? It was this bill that was introduced into the House. House Resolution 3590, which is called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Now, small story, unknown to most people. You can see the short title is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So after Nancy Pelosi was running the House at the time, she turned her back and John Boehner got out his pencil and he did this. And that's how it became known as Obamacare. Little known fact. Anyway, 700 pages. That's how long the Affordable Care Act is. How many times is EMS mentioned in the Affordable Care Act? You're close. 7 times. 1 for every 100 pages. There you go. Easy to remember. And it's usually in connection with, we want to do this grant program and make sure everybody's involved and make sure you talk to those EMS folks. So it's not like EMS is the primary driver. 7 times. I'm going to talk to you about 2 programs that are in the Affordable Care Act. One is going to teach us how we need to start thinking about the delivery of care that we're doing right now. One is going to give us some insight for opportunities for what we should be doing in the future. How many people have heard of these 2 programs? All right, a good percentage. Good. Value-based purchasing. So Medicare has now said, you know what, we're kind of tired of just getting these claims submitted and then we write a check for them, even though some people really like that job because it's easy, you know, get a claim, write a check, we're good. So now it's turned into the prudent purchaser of health care. The P's, as I like to call them, passive payer versus prudent purchaser. So what does value-based purchasing mean? So this is this way that Medicare paid bills before. You go to the hospital, you get stuff done, you bill Medicare, you get paid. Well, Medicare said, you know, that's not really a good model to use anymore. So we're going to change it in a couple of ways. We're going to start establishing some criteria that healthcare has to meet in order to get paid the full amount. And they broke it down into 3 sections: clinical care, patient experience, and mortality. So what do those mean? This is a slide straight off CMS website. You can go to their website and pull this down. 13 clinical processes of care measures, 8 patient experience of care dimensions, and 3 mortality measures. And you can see how it's divided up there. 45% goes to clinical care, 25% comes to outcome, 30% for the patient experience. And there's a couple, when I looked at this slide, I said, you know, there's a lot of stuff here that pertains to EMS. So if you look at the clinical process of care measures, the first 2 up there, AMI, fibrinolytic therapy received within 30 minutes of hospital arrival, so clot-busting drugs. Number 2, primary PCI received within 90 minutes of hospital arrival, so the door-to-balloon time, door-to-needle time, right? We're all familiar with those. So how many people saw this article in the New England Journal of Medicine in September of last year? So there was research that says, you know what, it doesn't really matter what door-to-balloon time is. We have the same mortality rate, no matter if you meet the 90-minute mark or you don't. I mean, really, it was a poor outcome measure. They should have looked at morbidity. But anyway, some of the recommendations that they came up with directly pertain to EMS and bringing them into that domain. So you can read this stuff on the side. Call 911. Okay, that makes sense. EMS arrival within 8 minutes. Okay, that's debatable. ECG should be obtained within 10 minutes after first medical contact. That's what we do. Emergency departments are measured in the 10-minute rule. They have to submit that data to Medicare. If you don't submit the data, it's fine, but then you get docked 2% off your hospital bills. Best clinical outcome within 120 minutes after symptoms. So they made sure to highlight a couple of things. It's no longer door to balloon, it's first medical contact to balloon. Who's the first medical contact in 40% of the patients? EMS. 10 minutes for that EKG to get done. There's the EMS component of that entire timeline. What we do matters. You salvage muscle, which means the patient doesn't have nearly the sequelae that they have after the injury, which means they don't develop congestive heart failure, which means we're not spending a ton of money on them later on in life. That's what it means. What we do matters. Let's go to the other domain. Patient experience of care dimensions. How many people do patient satisfaction scores right now? Okay, there's a few. You might want to think about it. 30% of Medicare reimbursement. I highlight a couple of things because, again, I think they're appropriate for EMS. Did the nurse or the doctor communicate with you? Well, who else communicates with patients? Dispatchers do. EMTs, paramedics do. Firefighters do. We all communicate with the patient. Pain management. Who else carries narcotics? EMS carries narcotics. We do pain management. We're proud of doing pain management. Do we measure it? Sometimes, sometimes not. Hospital cleanliness and quietness. Now, all right, I know you can't do much about the quietness part, right? It's a noisy diesel engine, usually people screaming at you, stuff like that. So you can't do much about that, but you can do something about it being clean. I mean, come on. Mortality measures. So look at the 3 mortality measures here. Acute myocardial infarction, 30 days. So what Medicare is saying is if within 30 days, if the patient was in the hospital with these 3 conditions and they die within 30 days of you discharging them, you know what, you're going to get dinged on reimbursement. Mortality measures. Well, does EMS do mortality measures? I don't know. Isn't that what the cardiac arrest registry to enhance survival is supposed to be about? It's really not about mortality. It's really about the amount we save. And there's plenty of studies out there that show the difference in where you are in the country, whether you're going to survive cardiac arrest or not. Now, if I'm the administrator of Medicare, I'm thinking, why would I pay an EMS service that has a 5% survival rate for cardiac arrest when I know that there's EMS agencies out there that can achieve 40, 45%? It's not like you're doing different things, right? It's a commitment to quality. So again, this is the slide that you have to pay attention to if you're a hospital administrator, because this is going to decide your reimbursement. Not only do they do that, they put you up against every hospital in the country. And they say, you got to meet a benchmark if you want to get paid a bonus. Now, there's no new money in this program, so where do they get the bonus money from? They get it from the bottom half. So you get penalized, and they take that money and they pay the people that do it well. There's no new money. So the old way, go to hospital, get stuff done, bill Medicare, get paid. It's not going to work anymore. Now it's go to hospital, get the right stuff done. Did the patient have good experience? Did they die? Are you at the top end of the benchmark? You'll either get paid or penalized. So how soon till that becomes this? ECG within 10 minutes, scene time within 20 minutes, transport to a PCI-capable center. Did you talk to the patient? Was your ambulance clean? Did you reduce pain? And what's your cardiac arrest survival rate? And that's what we're going to base our reimbursement on. It's not a big logic leap for me. How soon till we do this? You know what? You got a good survival rate. You took care of the patient. They had a good experience. We're going to pay you more money. And we're going to take it away from the people that didn't do this stuff so good. So the people that do this stuff now, that do the clinical process of care, that can look at their data and say, we're doing a good job, people that are doing patient satisfaction scores, and people that are measuring their survival from cardiac arrest outcome, they're going to be the competitors in this adaptive zone. They're going to be the ones that are in line to compete for those resources. One other program on where I think EMS it's going now and where it needs to go. How many people have heard of hospital readmission reduction program? So this is the old model, right? So it turns out that this was really sort of an even crazier model because it was a vicious cycle. These patients, CHFers, pneumonia, AMI, they go to the hospital over and over again, and they bill Medicare over and over again for their services. It turns into this circular environment, right? How many people have transported the same CHF patient over and over again because they're failing outpatient therapy for whatever reason? They can't get into the physician, their phone line is turned off, they don't have access to medications, or maybe they just need somebody to help them, period. I know how frustrated I was as an emergency physician and a paramedic to keep treating these people the same way. They would come in fluid failure, you would get them tuned up, you would either admit them or they go home. Your next shift, they're right back in. And it was crazy. Absolutely crazy. So Medicare, again, says, you know what, this is not a good way to do this. There's a study that came out from the Medicare panel. It said 1 out of every 5 Medicare patients gets admitted into the hospital again every 30 days. 1 out of 5 is 20% of people in the Medicare program are readmitted to the hospital every 30 days. That's crazy. 20%? That's insane. Now, it's not the entire 20%, it's not 20% of the entire Medicare population, but of people that were admitted, 20% of them come back within 30 days. 75% of them were preventable. And it cost us about $12 billion a year. How about if we take that $12 billion and we help them stay out of the hospital? No more. So this is the model that used to work, right? Patient goes to the hospital, goes home, goes back to hospital. We're going to cut out that access loop right there. You're going to get penalized with hospital. How many people have had talks with their cardiologists about these CHF patients? Coming back, Jeff Beeson did a wonderful talk earlier this morning about that. So this is what they said. If you're 65 years or older and you have any of these 3 conditions, AMI, CHF, pneumonia, you'll kind of see a pattern going here. The mortality measures were AMI, CHF, pneumonia. The readmission, AMI, CHF, pneumonia. There's a reason for that. These cost us a lot of money. If we can control these 3 diseases, we're going to be doing pretty good. So if these 3 patients get readmitted to the hospital within 30 days, you're going to get penalized. So what does that mean to us? Remember, old model. Patient goes to the hospital, comes home, goes back to the hospital. We're not going to do that anymore. Hospitals were fined about $280 million last year for this. Remember, we lost $12 billion. We're only recouping a fraction of that. Okay, now I'm going to turn a little wonky again. How many people read health affairs? All right, a couple folks read health affairs. Way to go. This was in, I believe it's November. Yep, November of 2013. So this is a paper about the Medicare Hospital Readmission Reduction Program. And you guys are probably sitting out there going, oh, this is probably a pretty boring paper. And it's certainly not a comic book, but there was something in the back that really struck me as I was reading this. And I want to show it to you. So it's not the 9%. Just like Darwin, it was the very last paragraph, the very last sentence. And it says this. Over time, one consequence of the Medicare HRRP may be a growing recognition that reducing readmission is a shared responsibility that belongs not only to the hospitals, but also to the patients Their caregivers and other community professionals and providers across the continuum of health and social services. So what does this mean to me, EMS? Well, we're community providers, right? We tend to think of ourselves as professionals, right? So what is a community professional and provider? EMS sees patients outside of the hospital. We do things like blood pressures and EKGs, and we can do medical histories. How many people now are doing some version of community paramedicine? So you do this stuff, right? You know what else we're really good at? We're really good about covering entire populations from a single point. I often tell people that EMS is the only socialized medicine in the United States. And it's true. When somebody calls 911, do they get to pick and choose who their provider is? Nope. Is there more than one ambulance service? Now, there might be more than one private service, but certainly not one answering 911. Most of the providers are trained to a specific level, and they have protocols, right? That's socialized medicine. But that gives us an advantage because we can organize things. We can do demand analyses. We know where these people live. We're completely comfortable going to people's homes and taking care of them. So now, instead of the paradigm being this, it's going to move. And it's going to move to this. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean a paramedic goes out all the time or even an EMT goes out all the time. Maybe it's we just organize the system because we're really good at that. Maybe this person needs a social worker. Maybe they just need a nursing assistant. Maybe they just need somebody to come out there or, give them a taxi voucher so they can get to the dentist or something along those lines. This is what it's going to mean. And EMS is perfectly positioned to do this. We've got to figure out a payment model. That's important. But we're positioned to do this. Another part of evolution is change in genetic code. So the environmental pressures and the competition, the people that are going to have an evolutionary advantage have to change their genetic code. So everybody knows what DNA looks like. These are the 4 building blocks of DNA. See, I remember this as a high school student because my professor went to Cape Girardeau. So I remember at Cape Girardeau. It's easy. So what is the DNA of EMS as we currently sit? It's 911, so single access point. Emergency response, transport to the emergency department, and then wait for another call. You're not going to be competitive in the new era of healthcare with that sort of DNA. You're just not. So who are the folks that are adapting? Who are the folks that are mutating? Who are the folks that are developing an evolutionary advantage? So they got such names like Gary Wingrove's Community Paramedic, MedStar Health Mobile Integrated Health Systems in Fort Worth. Talked to Jeff Beeson. As I said, he gave a wonderful presentation this morning about some of the effects that they've had in their population. Our partners to the north, they have single-payer system, and they're doing this because they realize the savings potential in this. Winnipeg is doing a great job at this. And our folks at REMSA are doing a fantastic job as well. There's 2 things that ring over and over again with people that try and tackle this problem. One is appropriate destination. So how many people get tired of taking people with behavioral challenges to the emergency department for medical clearance? I hated that. Because what these people needed was not an emergency physician. They needed psychiatric help. And all I did for them was generate a bill in the emergency department and then call the ambulance to take them across the street. I kid you not. It was across the street, and they had to take an ambulance ride over there. It was insane. That's no pun intended. So appropriate destinations. Not everybody needs to go to the emergency department. And appropriate care. So maybe we do need to monitor that CHF patient to make sure that they're not gaining too much weight, that they're taking their medications, and do a couple of simple tests on them. Maybe all they need is that social worker to get their electricity turned back on. But that doesn't mean you need to come to the emergency department, tie up an ambulance, do all of these really expensive things that are costing you and me healthcare dollars. And EMS is uniquely positioned to do both of these. So you got to start thinking about changing your DNA. You got to start becoming mutants. And EMS is really good about becoming mutants, by the way. It seems like every year there's something new that comes up, and it's because EMS people are very action-oriented, you know? We want to do the right thing, and we figure out the way to do the right thing. So let's build that ability to let you do the right thing. I'm going to put in my plug now for data. You ask any of these people that I mentioned, and those aren't the only folks. There's a lot of folks out there doing great work in community paramedicine or integrated healthcare. You got to know your data. If you're not collecting and analyzing and have robust data, you're not going to know where to start. So the first step really is looking at data. The Winnipeg system that I had mentioned earlier, they looked at their data and they saw that they were responding to the homeless shelter around 600 times a year. So what did they do? They said, well, this is kind of silly. Let's put a paramedic in the homeless shelter to take care of all these, small complaints. And if they really need to go to the emergency department, well, then it'll be valid. They dropped their responses to that homeless shelter by 60%. 60. That's a lot of money. But you have to look at your data. You got to know what it says. So in our adaptive zone of healthcare delivery, in the new environment, it's going to be the folks that do clinical process of care, patient satisfaction, mortality measures, and the people that can keep folks out of the hospital, take care of them in their environment. They're going to have the competitive advantage in this adaptive zone. Those are the ones that are going to be able to compete for that healthcare dollar. It just makes sense. We can't keep spending money the way we're doing it. Okay, so that's the wonky part, all right? So now I've scared the bejesus out of you. Now I'll talk about my journey from EMT to sitting in the situation room. So I started this, and maybe this is an adaptive zone. And maybe the resource you compete for, and all of you do this as well. You compete for maybe fulfillment in life or, a feeling of meaning. Why are you in this world? And maybe that's how we evolve as people. I don't know. I'm spitballing here. So mine started, as AJ said, in 1986. I took this EMT course. And it was cool. I mean, I really liked it, obviously. So I did that. I was going to college at the same time. Around my junior year of college is traditionally when physicians take the dreaded MCAT, the Medical College Admissions Test, which back in my day was number 2 pencils and a lot of bubble sheets. And you were competing with everyone else in the room for that resource, which was the coveted medical school slot. But there was a weird thing that happened. I was coming up on my junior year, and I realized I wasn't ready for this. And it wasn't that I hadn't taken all my classes, and I felt like I had known everything that I needed to know to take the MCAT and to do well on it. But this was the fault of my English teacher in high school. She made us read Henry David Thoreau. And if you read Thoreau and Why He Went to the Woods and Walden Pond, one of his sentences in there was, I didn't want to come to the end of my life and realize that I had not lived. And to me at that time, medical school didn't seem like living. It seemed more like prison. But you could plot out your life. Medical school residency, practice to pay off those exorbitant bills, and then you retire. Right, Bob? That's how it works? So I said, I'm not ready to do this yet. So my senior year of college, I decided I'm going to be a paramedic. So I enrolled in paramedic school. So I took my college classes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I took my paramedic courses on Tuesday, Thursday. And then I did my rotations and ride-alongs and stuff on the weekend. And it was great. I mean, I didn't sleep and I didn't eat very much, but it was fantastic. I was taking like 30 credit hours a semester. And it was great. And the people that you met in paramedic school were so much, you know, they were just so much more energetic than the folks that are in your college courses. And you know, it brought a lot of things to life. So suddenly you're learning about, you know, cardiac arrest and all this other stuff, where before you were learning about mitochondrial DNA and the Krebs cycle, and, you know, you're dissecting Henry V's soliloquy at the Battle of Agincourt on St. Crispin's Day. Everybody remembers that one, right? We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. That's where it comes from. All right, that was kind of cool. But anyway, so I went to paramedic school, and I became a paramedic, and much to the dismay of my mother. So here's a lesson: don't piss off your mom, all right? So my mom was an emergency room nurse. She, you know, she raised me. She had this dream of her son going to medical school, becoming a doctor, and coming back and crushing all those doctors that were mean to her in her whole career. Not really. My mom's very nice, and everybody was nice to her. So, but anyway, she was a little bit hesitant about this. And she was like, why do you want to do this? Just go to medical school. So here's tip number 1. Follow your dreams. Do what's in your heart. And for me, that was in my heart. So I went to paramedic school. You know, my classmates were fantastic. Even though I knew it was a stepping stone in my journey, to them it was a destination. And they were just as passionate and dedicated to it as I was to medical school. And that made it cool. So I did that, and then I graduated from paramedic school. And I got a job in Kansas City at Metropolitan Ambulance Services Trust. Where's Jerry? Jerry hired me. So if you want to know any dirt on Dr. Garza, Jerry's got it. So Jerry hires me in Kansas City as a lowly EMT. The worst decision he ever made. And so not only does he hire me, he says, hey, Alex, I want you to have these reporters ride along with you for a couple of weeks so we can do this magazine for the Kansas City Star. This is the local paper, Sunday magazine, Code 1, Life, Death, and the Paramedic. And it was cool, you know? So paramedic, the reporter and his cameraman were riding with us for like 2 weeks, me and my partner, Dan Lindholm, and they see everything that we see, right? And they take pictures, and they take notes, and they ask us questions, and they see the boredom of sitting around waiting for calls, but they also see those extreme highs of taking care of patients. No matter if it was, you know, taking care of crazy crack addicts with their kids in the background, or asthma patients who are going into respiratory arrest, or even the mundane things like transporting nursing home patients to the hospital. They saw it all. And it turned out to be a really good article. And it wasn't because I was in it. It was because they really wrote it in a way that showed what we do. And it was really profound. Lesson number 2, be careful what you say around reporters. They write down everything, and they remember everything, all right? So there's lesson number 2. So after a while, I said, okay, I really got to get on this thing if I want to become a doctor. And I go to medical school, University of Missouri, Columbia. Go Tigers. So I'm there, and all the students are running around, note service, blah, blah, blah. We need to set up study groups. I walk over to the EMS office and say, I'd really like to ride on that helicopter. Can you let me ride on the helicopter, please? And they let me. It was crazy. I tell you, I never worked a day in my life. So I got to ride around the helicopter and do some cool stuff, and that was fun. So again, it's my modus operandi. If I have a free moment, I got to fill it with something. So it was medical school during the week, work in EMS on the weekends, and grab a bite to eat and sleep every once in a while. So I did that. Then I went to residency, of course, emergency medicine. And that was cool. Medical director, did all that fun stuff. And you keep evolving as you're doing all these things. You're starting to learn new stuff, the way that new people think about things, and it influences the way that you're plotting out the rest of your life. And so the next influential thing that really made me evolve as a person, probably one of the most influential things, was in my second year of residency. I raised my right hand and I took the officer's oath, U.S. Army. Any Army people out there? Who? So who is an Army thing? And when I say hua, you're supposed to say hua back. All right? I'm going to try it again. Who? Oh, man, you guys would not make it through basic training, I'm telling you. So anyway, I'm standing there in my living room, and my girlfriend is there, and you know, an officer is over there, and all their Class A's and stuff, and you're taking the oath. And I didn't realize how important that oath was, I think, until many years later. But you know, you sit there, you raise your right hand, I swear to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign or domestic, right? All right, this right hand. But it became really important to me later on. That girlfriend turned out to be my wife. So she said, this guy's crazy, but he's probably also fun if he's that crazy. So lo and behold, around 2003, I get this phone call from my commander who says, hey, we want you to come into the unit for a couple days, look over some medical records. And I said, well, I'm kind of busy. I got a job, you know. He says, no, you don't understand. I need you to come in here and look at medical records. And I said, okay. So I go in there. And laid out on the operation officer's desk is the invasion plan for Iraq. So I was attached to the 4th Infantry Division. As AJ said, I'm a civil affairs officer, public health team chief. We're the hearts and minds strategy, right? So 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in Fort Bragg with a bunch of guys that you only know from 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year. And Colin Powell's on TV showing people vials of anthrax, and my wife is calling me. I got 2 young kids. One was a year old and one was 5 months. So my wife is calling, maybe this won't happen. I was like, honey, we're bursting at the seams with deploying soldiers here. This is going to happen. There's no two ways about it. So we deploy. You know, we go up through Kuwait. We enter in, I'm in Tikrit, Zululand province. So this is the archway going into the city of Tikrit. So things happen there. You know, I'm out. I'm running missions. They say your job is to get healthcare up and running. I said, okay. So I got this small team. I got like 10 soldiers, you know, and we're doing missions every day. We're driving around the country. You know, I'm up in Erbil and Mosul and in Baghdad. I'm on the Iranian border once. That was interesting. This is a picture of Al-Shagat, which is north. It's not quite as north as Mosul. That's my team sergeant, Sergeant Graybill. He was my medic. And of course, being an EMS guy, what do you have to get a picture of? The fire truck, right? Now, I swear I did not put that bullet hole in the windshield. So there we were. And we were doing all this great stuff, and we're meeting fantastic people. And we met the EMS people as well. So I was interacting a lot with physicians, nurses, nursing students, educators, the EMS folks as well. So this is the ambulance service for the Zululand province. This was the director. These guys were amazing. And not so much amazing because they were, you know, they didn't have a tenth of the skill as you guys do. But they were amazing because they came to work. And they lived in these really hostile conditions, and still they came to work. So I didn't know anything about the culture, the language, anything, but I had tremendous respect for them. One of these, or not one of these guys, but one of the stories that I brought back with me was the ambulances were used to shuttle Fedi in the early part of the war, so a lot of the soldiers were suspect of ambulances. The hospital was located right next to the forward operating base. So this ambulance is taking a patient home from the hospital, right in front of the fob. The car next to him decides to take a couple shots at the fob. Now, there's one thing that the American soldier does really, really well. They respond in force. They see an ambulance, they hear gunshots. Guess who's going to be the target? It's the shiny box. So there was rounds flying all over the place. Poor guy in the back, he's just trying to go home. I mean, how would you like it if you're taking somebody home and all of a sudden these rounds just start flying through the patient compartment? So the driver was shot in the shoulder. You know, the quick response force went out there and they realized they had shot the wrong person and that the bad guys actually got away. But still, they came to work. They came to work. They are some of the most resilient people I'd ever seen. And they taught me a lot. They taught me a lot about the ways of the world, how different people live, and at the end of the day, they all want the same things. They all want to live in peace. They all want to raise their families. They all want to have some degree of respect, right? So I found this quote by Louis Pasteur that I thought was very appropriate for some of the things that I did. And it said, "One does not ask of one who suffers, what is your country and what is your religion? One merely says, you suffer. That is enough for me." One of the most important things I took away was this moment that I was having with some of my dear friends there who are physicians. This is Dr. Saad Al-Rawi. He was probably my best friend in Iraq. So he's a forensic pathologist, so he does all the autopsies, and so, you know, we became quick friends. And I remember sitting in his office with all the other Iraqi doctors, and he turns to me, and we were talking about the newfound freedom that they had after the overthrow of Saddam. And he turns to me and he says, "We don't look at you as a soldier. We look at you as a doctor. You're one of us." And it was profound how much people that have the skill to heal, and that people that dedicate their lives to these things, it transcends everything. To him, I wasn't a uniform that said U.S. Army. To him, I was somebody who was there to help him. And that's because that's what we do. That's what you guys do. You ever notice when you're on like a scene with somebody, the police department is there, the patient relates to you, even though they hate this guy with the handcuffs? It's because you have that power to heal. So I kept evolving as a person through all these experiences. Some of them were not good. Some of the experiences weren't good. You know, I had some officers that were just complete train wrecks. I mean, they were putting their people at risk for bad reasons. And it was disgusting to me. But the other thing you realize is that there are people out there who will stand up and lead if given the chance. Especially my NCOs and enlisted, they were great. They were fantastic. Why am I mentioning this to you? This is Sergeant Zavala. He was one of my team NCOs as well. He's a fantastic individual. Yeah, I knew I could always rely on Sergeant Z to get the job done. They could get their soldiers to do things that are unfathomable to the majority of the American public. Unfathomable. And why did they do it? Because they knew that their team sergeant always had their back, and they knew that their buddy was always there for them. Just like you guys. Leadership is not leading somebody into battle. Leadership is looking out for your people. So I'm going to tell you just a brief story here about Sergeant Myers. You'll have to excuse me if I take a few minutes to pause, because sometimes it's still difficult. So Sergeant Myers is this gentleman over here. He's on the right-hand side. Sergeant Johnson's in the middle. Captain Lupomic is on the left. Great people, just fantastic people. I was in Kansas City. That's where my battalion was. These guys, you know, they have everyday lives out in, you know, the middle west of the United States, and then all of a sudden they're thrown into this very complex problem, right? So this is Sergeant Myers. He's a medic as well. So we divided our teams into two separate teams. Part of us were in Bakuba, and part of us were in Tikrit. He was down in Bakuba. So he's leading a team on a mission. The officer in charge was supposed to be my officer, but my officer went home on emergency leave. That's another story. So we had this filler officer, Medical Service Corps from Brigade. He's riding on the right-hand side. We have a gunner in back, Sergeant Bartles. They're coming back from this mission about something that was even stupid. It was about an argument over a chicken farm or something like that. And all of a sudden, there's an explosion. There's an improvised explosive device. The captain's side took the brunt of the blast. It blew Sergeant Bartles, who's a hulk of a man, probably twice the size of Sergeant Myers. He was the gunner in the back, blows him out of the Humvee, shreds his arm. It's hanging by a thread. Sergeant Myers, who was the happiest son of a bitch you ever met, stops the vehicle, looks over at his captain. He knows the captain is dead. Without thinking, grabs his weapon. He exits the vehicle. puts himself deliberately in harm's way to go rescue Sergeant Bartles. Scoops him up. He's twice the size of him. Scoops him up, puts him in the Humvee, races back to the fob to get him medical care. All this covered in shrapnel and blood. So why am I telling you this story? There's a lot of people that have similar stories to mine. But Sergeant Myers, he was this happy-go-lucky kid. And then one day he's thrown into this situation where he has to lead. And he did it. Nobody had to tell him. He did it. You can do things that you never thought you could do. Never forget that. Secondly, I already mentioned to you about leadership. Leadership isn't about being a hero. It's about providing for your soldiers, providing for your people, doing the mission, acting in the right way. Okay? It's looking out for your people. Third is, you know, less than 1% of the population serves in the American Armed Forces. Sergeant Myers has seen more in his years in the Army than people have seen their entire lifetime. You guys are exposed to things every day that most Americans cannot fathom. And it takes a toll on you. Take care of each other. Recognize that it's personal resilience, but you have to help your people out. So war has a way of clarifying things. It makes things that you thought were important not so important. Sergeant Myers was my friend. And it made me think about the things that are important in my life, which is my family. All this other bullshit went away. Remember, there's a lot of bullshit in life. Forget about the bullshit. So I came back. I was a changed man. I had evolved in my thinking. We did some really good work on cardiac arrest. We doubled our survival rate in Kansas City. I moved on to Washington, D.C., and so this is the Homeland Security part, the Washington Monument at Dawn. I would encourage you to go out and see the sites. So I went on to the White House. I had applied, or not applied. I mean, you don't really, there's no job listing for being assistant secretary. But, you know, so they asked me if I'd be willing to serve. I said, yes. You know, I went down to do this interview, and it's the weirdest job interview you've ever been on. I mean, I know I'm kind of old, but it reminded me of the movie Airplane. And this is what it was like.
Joey, you ever hang around the gymnasium? Joey, do you like movies about gladiators? Joey, have you ever been in a Turkish prison?
So that's what it was like. So I asked you a question like, have you ever been to Cuba? Do you have a gambling problem? Have you ever paid money for a prostitute? And I was like, well, no. How much money is a gambling problem? And no. So they decided I wasn't the biggest goober they'd ever met, so they let me go forward with the presentation. So really short story here about confirmation. Confirmation is a whole other animal. So you have to study your brains out. It's like preparing for boards again. So you can go in front of this committee so that they can ask you questions, and really it's just you chew up a bunch of time and then they send your nomination along. But anyway, so I'm preparing for my confirmation, and I got my handler there, who's the Office of Legislative Affairs guy, and he goes, hey, you bringing your family to the confirmation? I said, no, my wife is coming. I got 3 little boys. They're really busy. They will hate this. They will just squirm in the seats. They'll be distracting, blah, blah, blah. And he looks at me straight as an arrow, and he goes, you're bringing your kids. And I said, Ryan, you don't understand. Ryan was young. He just got married, had no kids. I was like, Ryan, you don't understand. These are 3 young kids. They're not going to enjoy this. And he looks at me and he goes, you're a freaking idiot. Do you think any senator is going to beat up some guy with their kids sitting behind him? They're not going to do it. I was like, this guy is good. So there I am in front of Senator Lieberman, Senator Collins, who I admire very much. And so I go through this hearing, and they're, you know, peppering you with questions. My kids are sitting back there, and they're asking you questions back and forth. And it was about 3 hours of this, right? And so my kids, you know, lo and behold, my kids don't make a sound. They're perfect angels. They're sitting behind me. And we're getting towards the end of it, and Senator Lieberman says, you know, he's concluding his remarks, and he says, oh, we've asked these kids to do something that nobody should ever ask them to do, which is sit still for 3 hours while adults talk about boring things. And I was like, oh, God, finally it's over. And Right at that moment, my oldest son, Alex, leans back in his chair and he goes, "Ah." Senator Lieberman, without missing a beat, goes, "Clearly this young man has felt what many in this room have felt before, but we're too afraid to say it." And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Bangs his gavel. Everybody in the room erupts in laughter. He's got a wicked sense of humor. He really does. Anyway, so they said, "Okay, you're not that big of a goober. Plus, this is the kicker. You put your confirmation vote right before the recess break. That way the senators have to vote on you if they want to go home. It doesn't matter if you're a goober like me. They have to vote on you." So anyway. So I go on to Homeland Security. You know, it was a fantastic job. You get to do cool stuff, you know, but there's a lot of painful stuff, too, that you don't see or hear about. But you meet with a lot of really neat people. You get to work with really fantastic folks. You get to work on these really complex problems that, you know, people don't understand. So this like whole toothpaste bombing thing, I mean, you're sitting in the room looking at that stuff, and it's cool. So, but just like when you're deployed, there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on in D.C. too. So you meet people that if it doesn't fit into their career path, they don't care about it, right? If it's good for the country, doesn't jive with what they want to do, doesn't matter, right? So I had a friend at Homeland Security who gave me some words of advice. He had been a Fed for a long time. And I was complaining to him about, you know, all these problems we had with, and sometimes it's like people in your own department that were, you know, causing you problems. And so I was complaining to him. He's like, "Alex, let me give you some advice." He said, "First off, friends come and go. Enemies accumulate. Be friends to everybody." So, "Oh, that's a good point, Bob." And then I was complaining some more about, you know, "Hey, I'm having a hard time sleeping at night because I keep thinking about this stuff." He said, "Alex, don't let the assholes rent your brain space." I said, "That makes sense, you know? Don't let them screw with your life, right?" It made total sense. So I left it, but I realized that wasn't the kind of person I didn't want to evolve into, and so I left, and I went back to St. Louis to be around my family and raise my kids there and do all that important stuff, not the bullshit, the important stuff. But it was fun, and it was interesting. And I don't mean it to make it sound like the federal position is you know, a constant headache, because there's a lot of really good, hardworking, decent people out there that have to put up with a lot of bullshit, like not getting a raise for 3 years or going through sequesters and doing all this other crap that a lot of us don't realize how hard it is on their families and their loved ones. So that makes you evolve as a person as well, and you learn the people that you don't want to be. So I stand before you today, a product of an EMS evolution, and there is good and bad in everything that you do. There's good and bad in being in EMS. There's good and bad in being in the Army. There's good and bad in being in Homeland Security. Now, when the bad starts to outweigh the good, that's when you leave, right? But there's one thing that was consistent throughout these things, and that was, you know, it's not about lights and sirens. It's not about blood and guts in the ER. It's not about bombs and bullets in the military. It's about the people you serve. You are a civil servant. That means you serve the people. And it's about the people you serve with. Your buddies in the trenches, your buddies sitting next to you, you got to take care of each other. What EMS taught me is EMS takes care of people in their environment, not yours. You're in their house, not your house. And we see things like we notice when the heat's turned off because the heating bill wasn't paid. Doctors don't see that. We look in the refrigerator to see if there's no food. Doctors don't see that. We're the ones that tell kids everything's going to be okay. We're the ones that hug moms and dads and tell them everything is going to be okay. We're the ones that sometimes put money in their pockets because we know that the only reason they called 911 is because they were cold and hungry. And sometimes the greatest act of heroism in EMS is compassion when people are hurt and understanding when things don't make sense. So those are the lessons that I learned from EMS that helped me evolve into the person that I am today. From being a paramedic, an EMT sitting in an ambulance, to shaking hands with the president. All that influences the way that you think. So I'll leave you with this challenge here today, and that is not to think about where you are, think about where you want to be. There's another story from Alice in Wonderland when she's trying to get out of Wonderland and she's talking to the Cheshire Cat, and she says, "Would you please tell me which way it is to get out of here?" And the cat says, "Where do you want to go?" And Alice says, "I don't care where I go as long as I get out of here." And the cat says, "Then it doesn't matter what path you take." Choose where you want to go. Choose your path. We are in such a unique position right now to become the profession that we want to be. More than just what a snotty triage nurse calls you, an ambulance driver, into a professional of out-of-hospital care. This is the moment. The environment is changing. You have to adapt. So that's my challenge to you, is to keep running and run really, really fast so that you don't become extinct. So thank you for your time and your attention and for indulging me. And thank you for proving that a 19-year-old, wet behind the ears, EMT back in 1990 was right when he said if more doctors saw what we see every day, medicine would be practiced differently. Thank you all.